In this video, we're going to cover the elements of an appraisal assignment. This is the initial step when the appraiser first interacts with their client. Oftentimes, it starts with a phone call to the appraiser where the client needs an appraisal service. In order to assess how to best proceed, the appraiser is going to ask their client 6 fundamental questions, including identifying the client and intended user, identifying the intended use, identify the purpose of the assignment, such as the type and definition of value, identify the effective date of the opinion, identify the relevant characteristics of the subject property, and then finally, identifying the assignment conditions. By addressing these 6 questions with their client, the appraiser is performing what we call the identification of the appraisal problem, which is a term of art to address the first phase of the appraisal process. The purpose of this phase is to develop a clear understanding of the problem to be solved, and it sets the parameters for the assignment. I'm Trevor Hubbard, and I'm an adjunct professor at the University of San Diego, and I'm also a senior review appraiser at the United States Navy and Marine Corps. I want to engage as many people as humanly possible, so if you could show your support by clicking the like button at the bottom of the screen and subscribing to my channel, I would be absolutely grateful. The client is defined by the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, or USPAP for short, as the party or parties who engage an appraiser by employment or contract in a specific assignment, whether directly or through an agent. The client is distinctly different than the intended user, which is also defined by USPAP as the client and any other party as identified by name or type as users of the appraisal or appraisal review report by the appraiser based on communication with the client at the time of the assignment. A client is inherently an intended user. It's important to note that just because you might have a copy of an appraisal, that fact alone does not make you an intended user. An intended user is determined by the appraiser at the outset of the assignment. Another important thing to note is that the appraiser must protect the confidential nature of the appraiser-client relationship. Although this standard does not apply to an intended user, it is very likely that an appraiser is going to extend them the same level of confidentiality just out of good business practice. Confidential information is defined by USPAP as information that is either identified by the client as confidential when providing it to an appraiser and that is not available from any other source, or classified as confidential or private by applicable law or regulation. Although confidentiality is an important decision that every client must make on their own, it might not be in the best interest of the client to tell their appraiser to keep absolutely everything confidential. What I mean by that is sometimes when appraisers are trying to confirm market data, it helps to be able to talk about what assignment they're working on. When appraisers confirm market data, they're probably going to be calling the buyer, the seller, the broker, or any other party involved in that transaction. It's very common for the person on the other side of that conversation to ask the appraiser, well, what is it that you're working on, and could I use that information for a project I might need? It helps if the appraiser can then have that open discussion and sharing of information. In this next section, we're going to cover intended use, which is also defined by USPAP as the uses of an appraiser's reported appraisal or appraisal review assignment results as identified by the appraiser based on communication with the client at the time of the assignment. So as you can see, the intended use is how the appraisal assignment is going to be used. The reason why it is absolutely critical that an appraiser identify the appropriate intended use of the appraisal assignment at the outset is because it will help dictate to the appraiser what the appropriate course of action should be. For example, if an appraiser knew that their appraisal was going to be used for an IRS-related matter, then that appraiser is going to know that they should use the IRS's definition of market value. As you can see, the process of assessing the proper elements of the appraisal assignment is a rather iterative process, and it's going to require sound judgment on the appraiser's part. In this next section, we're going to identify the purpose of the assignment, which is the process in which to identify the appropriate definition of value. Believe it or not, there are dozens of definitions of value, such as market value, value in use, and investment value. And the process of determining which definition is incredibly important because that can impact value. Appraisers are required to identify the appropriate definition of value and state that definition in the appraisal report. Thinking back to the IRS example, it's absolutely critical that the appraiser use the right definition of value based on the intended use. In this next section, we're going to cover the effective date of the opinion, which is defined by USPAP as the date to which an appraiser's analysis, opinions, and conclusions apply. Most professionals refer to this as the date of value, which can be in the past, in the future, and even now. Say hi, Prince. When the date of value occurs in the past, this is called a retrospective date of value. This might happen if an appraisal is ordered because of an insurance claim that happened in the past. When the date of value is in the future, this is called a prospective date of value. This might happen if an appraisal is ordered to determine the market rent of an upcoming lease renewal. Often, the date of value is current, or the date that the inspection was done, or the date that the appraisal was ordered. In this next section, we're going to cover the relevant property characteristics, which include the legal rights, the physical elements such as land and building, the location, and other relevant property characteristics. The level of detail in this description will vary depending on the reporting option used. For example, an appraisal determining the market rent is probably going to have a lot more description of the lease than an appraisal of the fee simple interest in the same property. In this final section, we're going to include assignment conditions, which include general limiting conditions and assumptions, extraordinary assumptions, hypothetical conditions, and finally, jurisdictional exceptions. Assignment conditions are typically listed in the initial phase of the valuation process. General limiting conditions and assumptions are required frequently because of limitations in data research, property inspection, and other areas. Unlike general assumptions, which may frequently be used in many appraisal assignments, an extraordinary assumption is specific to each appraisal assignment. An extraordinary assumption is defined by USPAP as an assignment-specific assumption as of the effective date regarding uncertain information used in an analysis which, if found to be false, could alter the appraiser's opinions or conclusions. According to USPAP, in developing an appraisal, the appraiser must identify any extraordinary assumption necessary in the assignment. And an extraordinary assumption may be used in an assignment only if 1. The extraordinary assumption is required to properly develop credible opinions and conclusions. 2. The appraiser has a reasonable basis for the extraordinary assumption. And 3. Use of the extraordinary assumption results in a credible analysis. An example of an extraordinary assumption is an appraisal of a former gas station in which the appraiser assumed there is no contamination. The appraiser is making an extraordinary assumption that there is no contamination, even though that may not be the case. If the extraordinary assumption is found to be false, then the assignment results will be affected. The consequences of this contamination would not have been accounted for in the appraiser's analysis if the extraordinary assumption is found to be false. If the contamination is discovered to exist, then it's very well possible that the client will request to have the appraiser perform an analysis that is without that extraordinary assumption. This would be a new scope of work and a new assignment. Appraisals can have multiple extraordinary assumptions, and it's good business practice for the appraiser to communicate those conditions in a clear and concise manner. A hypothetical condition is defined by USPAP as a condition directly related to a specific assignment which is contrary to what is known by the appraiser to exist on the effective date of the assignment results, but is used for the purpose of analysis. In developing an appraisal, an appraiser must identify any hypothetical conditions that are necessary in the assignment. USPAP goes on to say that in developing an appraisal, the appraiser must identify any hypothetical conditions necessary in the assignment. A hypothetical condition may be used in an assignment only if 1. Use of the hypothetical condition is clearly required for legal purposes, for purposes of reasonable analysis, or for purposes of comparison. And 2. Use of the hypothetical condition results in a credible analysis. Unlike an extraordinary assumption, which may or may not be true, a hypothetical condition is known to be false, but is accepted to be true by the appraiser for the purposes of developing a credible assignment result. Relating back to that former gas station example, the appraiser would utilize a hypothetical condition if that contamination were known to exist. The hypothetical condition in this example would be credible if the client needed to know the value of the property as if uncontaminated so they could use that information in a feasibility analysis for cleanup. Conversely, if the client asked the appraiser to employ that hypothetical condition so that they could just, hide that the property is contaminated from everyone, well then it is the appraiser's job to decline that assignment condition because it would not be appropriate based on the intended use. Although the appraiser must give notice to the intended user that the extraordinary assumption and hypothetical condition may have impacted the assignment result, that appraiser may not necessarily be required to report the specific value impact. USPAP defines jurisdictional exception as an assignment condition established by applicable law or regulation which precludes an appraiser from complying with a part of USPAP. A jurisdictional exception is typically very rare, and it only applies when the applicable law or regulation precludes compliance with the specific professional standard. Instructions from the client alone would not constitute an appropriate jurisdictional exception. Thank you so much for watching this video on the elements of the appraisal assignment, which is the beginning part of the appraisal process. If you enjoyed this content, please show your support by hitting the like button at the bottom of the screen and subscribing to my channel.